Hello, everyone. My name is James Introcaso. I go by he, him. I am your host for Tabletop Voices. And today I've got a legendary, and I will say legendary already, game designer with me. Her name is Ruth Tillman. Ruth, why don't you introduce yourself and let people know what you've worked on in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Hi, I'm Ruth Tillman. I am a librarian in my day job, and for fun, I write role playing games, play video games, make quilts, play role playing games. I use she, her pronouns. I have worked on quite a few smaller pieces of role playing game material, including material for Trail of Cthulhu scenarios, material for Harlem Unbound, which recently came out. I was one of the three authors on Cthulhu Confidential, wrote a substantial portion of that book, particularly around Vivian Sinclair, New York City, and playing Cthulhu Confidential as a woman. And then I've also done some material recently for the Hideous Creatures bestiary, which will be coming out this spring from Pelgrane Press. You can already get it as a PDF on their site. And I've started doing a little bit of my own work too by creating something called the Creeping Kudzu, which is a monster zine that uses a variety of systems, including 13th Age is sort of what it's geared at, which is one of the systems for which I've done monsters for their bestiary too. So I guess that's a broad overview of my work.
Yeah, you've done a lot of awesome stuff, and I'm super duper excited to talk with you about it today. But first, I want you to take me all the way back to the first time you played a tabletop role-playing game. Set the scene for me and tell me, what were you playing?
See, I was 18. I was a first-year student in college, and there was this amazing girl who wore cloaks and stuff and was in some of my classes. I also wore cloaks. And so we met up in the cafeteria, and she invited me to her D&D game. And so when I got there, we were playing D&D. We were playing 3rd edition. I
Nice.
was a druid, because we had a long talk about the kinds of things we could do, and the fact that druids spells don't have to be prepared was a big selling point for me. It I said, you know what? I don't know this system well enough that I feel like I could make good judgments about what I prepare every day. And so I feel like maybe being a spellcaster isn't for me, and so we talked about it some more. And I had a badger named Horace. This
Yes.
became very controversial because somebody else had had their familiar killed because apparently their familiar wasn't allowed to, released into the wild, sent to a woods to live because it turned out that their class wasn't allowed to have familiars. And our DM was trying to be, it was his first time DMing, and he was trying to be really precise about the rules. He was probably 19 at the time. He's eased up since. I've still played with him. He's a little more flexible and less likely to kill your pet wolf. Yeah, actually, the druid died in a forest fire. That was my first
Oh,
character.
wow. Oh, no.
Yep. Not immediately. I played her for 2.5 years, and then she died in a forest fire, which was
no.
hideously ironic because she was also a halfling.
Oh,
So
I
I
see.
had a very creative and spontaneous group of people to play with, and also everybody else could run at 30 meters per, or feet. So I could only run at 20. Yeah, so that was a fun dive in. It was a bunch of English majors and theater kids, which was a great combo for a D&D game. And so I played that all the way through college, and yeah, that's how I got my start.
That's awesome. So you played that all through college, and at some point you decided to make a go of this, but I assume along the way you must have discovered role-playing games beyond Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Yes.
So when did you discover that? Specifically, when did you discover Pelgrane Press, who you do a lot of work with?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about that. I moved to the DC area and got involved a bit with the DC Game Day things that were happening there, and met a lot of people who played games in the area, and eventually got into my own gaming group. But I really think that I started experimenting with those at the DC Game Day and by meeting up in person with people that I had met online. So Twitter was very important for me at that point in my life for getting to know other people across DC, because if you know anybody in DC, nobody likes to go out and do stuff. It's like, oh, that's 45 minutes to go 5 miles. Like, I have to take 2 trains and a bus? Really? Or I drive and I get stuck in traffic. So it was really helpful to make all those connections online so that we didn't have to build some of that in person. And they introduced me to everything from single D6 systems, not actually Gumshoe, to other stuff.
Oh, wow.
And somebody, I'm trying to remember who, but somebody in that area really liked to run Gumshoe. And actually Kevin Culp, another Pelgrane writer and developer of Time Watch, and then of some other working now on the oh dear, it's called Gumthus, is the it's the Conan Terry Pratchett watch kind of world. So I'm trying to remember the actual book title because it's been announced, but he came down and ran a Night's Black Agents game, which was fantastic. And so at this point I said, well, you know, I had bought some supplemental books for Trail of Cthulhu at the DC Game Day, just to read them as we had a little silent auction thing, and I wanted to just read them as ideas for material for Cthulhu stuff. And then I thought, oh, you know what, I actually really like the system, I should start getting into it. So yeah, after that I bought Eternal Lies and sort of went off from there.
That's awesome. That's really cool. And so at what point then did you make the leap from playing games as a hobby to starting to write and get paid for the work that you were doing?
I think it's because I have a hard time actually running other people's material. I can take it, I can look at it, I can adapt it, but I have a lot of ideas of my own. I guess I've always been interested in stories, and I had done some more nonfiction type writing before that. And so I started writing up my own scenarios. And when I was running one of the con, I was telling Kat and Simon all about it, and kind of Robin happened to be in the booth and everything. And so they said, well, if you send us a 10,000 word draft, like, this sounds interesting, we would be interested, but, you know, can you write it up and send it to us? So essentially I wrote that kind of on spec, as it were, because they didn't yet know if I could articulate putting it into the format for a scenario, because it's very different to write something that's loose enough you can play, and to write something that other people can play. And I definitely got a lot of back and forth coaching on how to write potential, how to write like concrete stuff, just say it. Because if you don't just say it, sometimes it's like, okay, why are you building in so much potential here? Just say something interesting and keep going. Because the thing is, a GM can take that and go, I don't like that, I'm going to change it. And so understanding where you should build in flexibility for the GM, and where you should just expect the GM to either go with what you've written because it's easiest, or change it themselves. And that was a bit of work. That draft went back and forth a few times, but it was very helpful to get that feedback, and then sort of went from there. After that, it was writing for the Edom files and the Book of Changing Years, and just sort of spiraling forward.
I mean, I love pretty much everything that's on your resume. I am a huge fan of, and the only things I'm not, it's because I probably haven't picked them up yet and read them. So there is just a huge breadth of stuff, and it's awesome to hear about that learning experience of like when knowing when to build in potential, and knowing when to say this is how it is, change it if you don't like it. That for me is a really tough thing to do, because I want to be able to cover every option, and you can't, right? That's a Sisyphean task.
It's so hard sometimes when you start thinking through every way, like, well, what if they played it this way, or what if they played it that way? And you have to come up with your point where you say, at this point, the GM will ad lib. Like, I've done it. in my own games, so
Yeah.
there's no reason that other people can't do it. It's just allowing yourself to make peace with that. And then of course it goes out to playtest, right? And if you get playtest feedback that's like that I didn't know what to do here, or this character was improperly introduced, or "Mer," and
Mhm.
go, okay, how do I act on this feedback? Sometimes you can go to the feedback and go, well, that's not what I was going for.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Mhm.
but most of the time it's like, oh yes, okay, I can make this a little less concrete and this a little more concrete and change up, make some more connections or take away some connections because they were like, it was too much, too many options at this point. So
Yeah, which I imagine is, I do some designing for D&D, and I think that that's hard to do for a D&D adventure. I can only imagine what writing a mystery for Gumshoe is like. It feels like the plots of Gumshoe mysteries need to be much tighter than, say, a go in this cave and kill all the kobolds kind of D&D adventure.
yeah, although I think your best D&D adventures have some really some kind
Mhm.
of narrative or thread or plot. The more I've written
Definitely.
mysteries, the more I've found that, like, if I pick up a romance novel, for example, not every, but a substantial number of romance novels are actually mysteries that have, like,
Mhm.
explicit sexual scenes and are set in a particular period of time, and so, like, I actually after I discovered this, I became much more fond of reading romance novels because they aren't always mysteries, but they are always some kind of problem-solving situation. Again, there's subgenres of those little thin white paperback books. Those are generally not, they're written
Mhm.
to the you can read them in 2 hours and be done. But the ones that get into more complex plots, it's like, "Oh, is it, you know, what's up with this cove in the south of England and, is it pirates? Is it the French? Um, is it somebody in town that's causing trouble? Is it like some old thing of theirs coming back to haunt them?" And then, of course, there's
Mhm.
other themes that show up in romances, but seeing that kind of thing show up, seeing it show up in other places besides mystery novels has been also helpful in like helping me think about how almost any story can have a mystery or be a mystery and working from there. And I think that does kind of help, although I can get a little too into it sometimes if I'm trying to do a 20 a D20 kind of game. It's like, okay, deep breath. It's doesn't have to be a mystery. It can just be the
Mhm.
challenges and other parts of it make the story.
Definitely, definitely. So I really want to talk to you about Cthulhu Confidential. Cthulhu Confidential is the first Gumshoe one-to-one game
Mhm.
that we have seen, which is for one player and one GM. I played it with a friend. I loved it. It was incredible and amazing, and it's a really, really great role-playing game that I found was like super intense at times because it's just two people talking the
Yeah.
whole time. What were some of the challenges of designing a game and scenarios for one player, one GM?
So the design work was primarily done by Robin Laws. We gave some feedback as we used it as a tool or discussed what did or didn't work for us as writers, and then of course I play tested his scenario that's in the book, which was a lot of fun and also very intense. He'll tell you that people got stuck because they wouldn't go see a particular character that they were afraid of, and I was on that list. I had read so much history that I was like, I'm not going to talk to this guy. I mean, like, but I mean, it's genre. I was getting out of the genre and getting protective of my character, even though I should have been like, yes, I'm all in. I'm going to go see the thing. That's normally how I play, and I just got like so freaked out instead of being like, all right, you know what? I'm playing a game. I'm gonna do this thing, like, I'm gonna open the door with the screaming behind it or whatever. Um, but yeah, it's a very, very intense game, and I think the one of the hardest things for writing it is you don't get that, uh, player banter at the table.
Mhm.
So, when you have a whole bunch of players, the player banter eases the mood, but it also is a way that players brainstorm what they're going to do. And so that's the
Mhm.
thing that I've had when, being the GM for it as well is you have to potentially be part of that brainstorming while also knowing the answer.
Right.
You may have to make things even more clear and explicit, and you have to understand that a person may just not think of the thing because they were not going to be the person at the table who thinks of it, or that lack of back and forth means that they only think of one of the multiple options. And so when you're writing it, you kind of have to think about what would happen if a player just sort of didn't think about this whole aspect, or what would happen if a player got more interested in this part than this part. And so one of the things that I've done is I wrote in some potential alternatives, and I think Robin did that in some of his scenarios, and maybe Chris as well. I don't recall. Where it's like, hey, if you wanted to make this be a little different, you could change this. I did that with my Midnight Sub Rosa scenario for Trail of Cthulhu as well. I wrote a whole thing on, you want to run this in a town full of ghouls? Here's how. Here's two ways. Here's an appendix and two ways you can do this. So just saying, yeah, this could be true. If your player gets so excited about this being true, this could be true, and here's a little bit about how. And yeah, I really enjoyed writing for that. I also really enjoyed like mentally diving into the world of noir gangsters, 1930s New York City. I recently traveled there, and it was a whole new experience after having spent basically a year with my face in the 1939 travel guide for New York City. And that was, yeah, it was really interesting to see all the things again and think about it and see how the cities evolved and see what I could still experience from that.
Yeah, and like you said, you spent a lot of time with that because you also wrote for Harlem Unbound,
Yes.
so which is more Cthulhu in more New York City.
Yes.
How was that different? How was writing for Harlem Unbound different than writing for Cthulhu Confidential?
I think there were a couple of things. So to preface some of the work, Chris asked me because we had worked on Cthulhu Confidential together, and I was writing about New York City, and I had written one of my scenarios was actually set in Harlem. And so when he sort of asked me what I would like to write for it, I said, I've done a lot of reading about Harlem at this time. I would feel the most comfortable writing the sort of material that I didn't put in this in Cthulhu Confidential. And I think it was two very different perspectives on who you were in the city that made it interesting. When I wrote, for example, the Vivian Sinclair scenario that takes place a good deal in Harlem, I made a
Mhm.
note at one point, and I actually have a section that says, you know what? Here's how to play this scene. Here's like various tests. So you would roll your dice to see how you did on interpersonal stuff, on whether or not you could hang out with these musicians afterward. But if you even if you roll really well or make pushes or do something like that, you are still going to be a white woman hanging out with a bunch of black musicians, and you're a journalist. So you are in
Mhm.
two levels a risk to them. And it's not going to be that, you're going to be a bit of an outsider, and that's how it is. Like, and sort of here's the world that you're entering. And so coming from Harlem Unbound, though, it was very much this is your world. Um, Here are the things growing up out of it. I think with Chris's like feedback and guidance too, you could be a lot more. I don't want to say so there was a feeling of whether you're an outsider coming in or an insider. So you can have, for example, a whole scenario that you might feel otherwise uncomfortable about because it's a very different dynamic if you've got a white detective coming in and solving a problem where all the villains are black, as compared to
Mhm.
a group of black adventurers coming in and solving villain issues in their own community, which is more of maybe a Luke Cage thing. So
Mhm.
who is us and who is being otherized? And you still may have a whole bunch of white players playing black people in a community. So there's still some potential there, but it was much about whether you were talking about your community or a community that, as a white um, Vivian Sinclair, you would be coming into as a known outsider. So I think that was sort of the perspective. I had a little more freedom, I think, in working with Harlem Unbound, especially having Chris there to give me feedback on, what was or wasn't pushing edges. Because there were weird, like there were cults happening there. There was a hospital where it actually was a lot of white doctors and nurses. So I was like, this could be a place where like things start happening to your family in a way that like
Mhm.
it would be a little more weird if Viv came in and was like a third party, you got white doctors and nurses, white detective, black patients. So I think the racial dynamics of imagining the player characters opened it up a bit more.
Mhm. Are you a big Lovecraft fan? Are you you've worked so much in the world of the Cthulhu mythos? So are you a fan of those works, or are you what is it? I guess my question is really, what is it that you enjoy about the Cthulhu mythos?
Um, so I think what I enjoy most about the Cthulhu mythos can be exemplified from the in the story From Beyond,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is one in which a person essentially discovers that there's an alternate overlapping reality with ours, these horrible things that are floating around, but we can't see each other. So like one might be in my hand floating through my body right now, but it's okay because I can't see them, they can't see me.
Hmm.
And a scientist comes up with a device that reveals this. I
Mm.
think it's so what I really, really like is the weird. I'm a fan of King in Yellow stories, the strange surreality in those, although I don't feel as personally able to capture the surreal. I would like to eventually
Mhm.
try writing my own scenarios to play the Yellow King role playing game with my group. I've played some already written stuff with them,
Oh,
um,
cool.
but I'd like to try actually like bringing that in and trying my own ideas on it. But I've loved those stories. I've read them and reread them over and over again. Um,
Mm.
and so I think that where I stand with Lovecraft himself is a bit dodgy because I appreciate a lot of the idea contributions, but I, at the same time, wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily recommending his works to people. I've done a
Mhm.
podcast for a few years on Clark Ashton Smith. He also has some issues, but I found him a lot less so. Um, and I really enjoyed some of his stranger genres. Really gets into the fun stuff that's more D20 friendly, like necromancers and you know that kind of thing.
Totally.
So many necromancers. Oh my god, so many. Yes.
And you've done all kinds of stuff. You're not just a Cthulhu person, right? You've taken and worked on things like 13th Age. You worked on a great book for Time Watch that I
Oh
really
yeah,
love that I want to talk about a little bit.
sure.
Pelgrane has this reputation for making these great books like Dracula Unredacted that
Hmm.
are essentially massive player handouts that help guide a campaign, right? And if you've never picked
Yeah.
up one of these products from Pelgrane, you should definitely check it out. So there's one for Time Watch, which is a time travel gumshoe game where you are going through time, solving crimes, trying to keep the time stream intact. Very different from something like Cthulhu Confidential or Harlem Unbound in
Yes.
tone. It's called the Book of Changing Years. Is this big handout that goes with it? I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what the Book of Changing Years is like and what it was like to write in the Time Watch style.
It's interesting because I that was one of the first things that I ever wrote for Pelgrane, I think.
Mm.
It's been a number of years since I wrote the material, even though it was published a while later. Um I'm thinking like one of the exciting things for me was thinking about what story. So the book is consists of a number of entries, and I believe they ended up finally, which I think wisely, putting them in sort of chronological order by entry. So that you've got your first entry is in this date, and then you jump forward and then you jump backward and so forth. And to not say putting them all in order so that you would have to like turn to this. It could have been very choose your own adventure. Like now turn to page
Mhm.
96 for the next entry in this. But it's your traveler's journal kind of thing. So it's a lot of first person things. And I actually, when I got the book, I had forgotten which ones I wrote. And I thumbed through it for a while. And after a while, I was like, well, this one I clearly wrote because I remember that. But it was really fun because you first came up with the idea of like what story, what concept do I want to tell? Like, right? Is it something meddling in a pharaoh's tomb? Is it something else? And then you think about, which is the Egyptian one is one that I did do.
Oh, cool.
And then you think about things like, all right, how would this affect things that I just happen to know about? Like, what are all the things that I know about in culture, history, effect, like the Egyptomania of the 20s? Like, how can I write something interesting where something is there and it's wrong, which is a fun part of Time Watch, is like coming up with what would happen farther down the line. And so going off into the farther future, going farther back into the past, and essentially solving, I don't remember the actual problem that happened, but it was, in a tomb. And
Hmm.
so it gets released when the tomb is opened. So what are
Oh.
the, different effects that would happen? Um, so instead of thinking about a story as a concrete block of time, you think about a story as something with far, far repercussions. I haven't yet been able to write a Time Watch scenario because
Hmm.
I don't know how to write that kind of play down. I love it as play. Like, oh, somebody be like, all right, we're at this restaurant. I want to go back in time and now I'm a regular here. That's a
Oh.
great way to like do time travel in the game, right? Now you know the owner. Now you're that big
Mhm.
tipper, right? Like suddenly you've done a thing that's made you way more able to say, hey, can you listen to those guys at those table over there and like give me a gist of what they're talking about to a waitress because you've been tipping her $20 on like a $20 bill, for the last 6 months. Awesome. You have just bought yourself like some really good information.
Hmm.
And thinking about that kind of possibility, what we had talked about earlier with, oh, where do you leave it open and where do you leave it closed? I think I'll have to read a lot more adventures before I can possibly write one down. I could come up with ideas in my head because I can ad lib. If I know
Hmm.
the general things, I can make up characters, I can make up places. I haven't actually GM Time Watch yet, but I have some ideas. My own game.
Hmm.
But I would like to try that, but I just don't know how to write it down. So it was fun to write this down and come up with like, here's all these places. And so I could kind of force characters into that mostly,
Hmm.
and allow other GMs to say, well, I'll adapt it and they can put it 5 years earlier or whatever. Like, here's your main facts. Do with
Hmm.
them as you
Hmm.
will. Which is what I got to do with that, right? Like, you could have turned it into a scenario seed. You could have just come up with some ideas. You could have figured out how to play that as a scenario and like, here's the element of each scene.
Nice.
There's a lot of possibility in that book.
It's really cool. I love those books because that's the exact style of play they encourage, right? Is like,
Mhm.
here's this, go from here, fill in
Yeah.
the gaps, that sort of thing. It's so great. I really, really do recommend those that people check them out. And I also am a big fan of some of your other work that's been done not in the gumshoe space, right? You've worked on Feng Shui 2, you've worked on 13th
Yeah.
Age. So what has it been like working on some of those other systems?
So with Feng Shui 2, I wrote some. I'm trying to remember exactly. They weren't exactly scenarios, but they were about 2,000 word settings slash
Hmm.
seeds slash um, characters and pieces of info. And I think those were actually fairly different experiences. I appreciate it when people come up with me with a this is what we want. Here's some examples of the writing. Here's your word goal, and it's some idea that I want to go with. So like one of them was an ancient city in China, and one of them was the summer of the Zodiac Killer. Which I was like, yes,
That's
give me
cool.
the Zodiac Killer. I can create color and excitement. And so, like, what is it like when the hippie's dream has gone a little sour and you got the Zodiac Killer out and about and all kinds of stuff that's happening around then? It's very much actually in line with the fall of Delta Green, which I have not written stuff for, but would like to
Hmm.
start running as well for my poor players. I have to
Oh,
figure out what I'm
nice.
going to do for them this coming year. And so I think I really enjoyed that like mental time space. For 13th Age, it was interesting because I didn't. When I went into it, I started off with writing my own stuff, the Eldritch icons, which are now on my Arkham Archivist blog, and
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
a subset of icons with Clark Ashton Smith contexts. So you have the druid versus, oh god, I of course I picked the one that I can't really say, but Yaglanech, Yaglanech, or she's a
Mhm.
big old deer antler headed lady. Um, or the so and what would a blood druid be? And so I started exploring this idea of like blood magic in 13th age. And so I don't think about myself
Yes.
as someone who like likes to come up with like monsters and such. But when
Mhm.
I came at it from this other angle of like, what's the story hook? What's the game idea? I found myself more able to do that. And then Rob Heinzu asked me if I could write up an icon idea type character for the 13th Age Bestiary 2. So I wrote the Great Ghoul section.
Mm.
And in that, that's based a lot on some of my ideas of Mordigian. I love ghouls. I adore ghouls. I will die for ghouls. I will die and become a ghoul. Um, I'm a little too into ghouls. Like if you ask me about one thing that I'm a little too into, it's probably ghouls. And so I had a lot of fun like coming up with what his jackal-headed priests would be like, right? Because he doesn't
Mhm.
ghouls already existed in 13th age. So like what would a jackal priest be like? What's his relationship though, this fallen icon? So he's not an actual
Mhm.
new icon. It's a former icon of a previous age that's become a big thing. It's like, how did he lose his power? It becomes like a whole story. How did he lose his power? What is the behavior of these different levels of people like? What are his horror kinds of things? And I came up with this like maw as a thing, and Rob added a shadow, which is kind of fun too. And like ways you could face
Cool.
it in an arc, so the maw is opening in different places, and you have to kind
Mhm.
of eventually defeat it. And so thinking about a monster as a thing that is part of a story, not just as a, which is how I'd always done it, is like, okay, an idea, a horror, a stat block, go. That's actually what inspired me to write my most recent monster zine, which is the Creeping Kudzu, um,
Mhm.
where
That's I
I
wanted to
pulled out
ask you
that
about
idea.
that too. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I pulled out that idea. I'd come up with this idea a while ago of what I called Kudzu Punk, which is a
Mhm.
little bit like solar punk meets Southern Gothic meets weird. And I was trying to
Nice.
classify and describe certain kinds of fiction, everything from like Day of the Triffids to Annihilation, which I had just read. And I was like, what is this genre? What is this genre where something green and natural and is taking over the world and it's wonderful and horrifying at the same time? And how does it fit in with things like the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 Young, who's another like thing that I like, and her Dark Young, which they're like trees and they're like plants, but they're also monsters. And like, what does that mean? And so
Mhm.
I'd explored that a little bit in the Eldritch Icons, and I said, well, I have other ideas for kudzu punk type things, like maybe a little short story zine or collection, and some with poetry and art and such. I have many ideas, but I was like, also, the creeping kudzu is an amazing idea for a monster because it um being snared by vines is very classic. So like what is it like if you've got like people that are being controlled by this thing, and what is it like if it like puts out its own um like a person who's like mind controlled versus a person who's actively infected. So you could have like a
Mhm.
kind of a small town where everybody's influenced by this mood, as it were, of the woods, except that it's not just a mood. It's a weird collective sentience that's kind of overborne their minds, versus a person who's like actually physically infected with the vine, versus a spriggan maybe that comes out of the vines and is actually a vine type creature, versus the actual patch of kudzu itself, which could swallow a house. Like, right, you wake up and you're in a house and oh gosh, it's covered in kudzu overnight. Because I learned things like kudzu can grow at a rate of 1 foot a day. Kudzu's
It's
like
crazy.
roots can be 12 feet thick or something like that. It's ridiculous, and that's the real stuff. It's a real life
Mhm.
monster, and I love it.
Mhm.
Um, fortunately, I do not live in an area that's beset by kudzu, but so I'm a little lucky that way yet. I have to say,
Mhm.
I was talking to a soil scientist recently, and she said, "Oh yeah, no, we'll have about the climate of Georgia in
Yeah.
another 40 years here." So like, okay, great. She's like, "Yeah, our staple crop here will probably become cotton." I'm like, "We're gonna get kudzu too, right? Yeah, we're gonna get
Uh,
kudzu."
you know it. You know it's coming.
I
Well, and the other thing is, I don't giant kelp, which grows
Mhm.
up from the ground in these big dense forests under
Yeah. Oh.
water, grows 18 inches a day, right? So like, there's all kinds of terrifying plants out there that we all need to be on our guard
Yeah.
about. The plants are coming for us. Okay.
Right. I'm gonna keep that in mind for either the Creeping Kudzu edition 2 and also for, other kinds of other kinds of Kudzu Punk stuff because I think, water Kudzu Punk is definitely, like, you've got things that you could do with that, so I'll keep
hmm
that in mind,
hmm
like, oh my gosh. Yeah.
Water kudzu punk.
Yeah,
I love it. I love it. So we have some questions from people in chat.
okay.
Blake Ryan Batman wants to know, did you ever use Cthulhu inspired things in a D&D game or like another D20 game, that sort of thing?
I think definitely weird type things, I've had
Mhm.
so I think it's less direct. I've never played a directly what I would call a directly Cthulhu inspired game.
Mhm.
But for example, with the 13th Age stuff, I like to bring in creatures like Mordigian as like your underarching or because he's Mordigian, big bad or something like that. So I think yes, I could say like there's a number of monsters from the Cthulhu Trail of Cthulhu or Call of Cthulhu Monster Manual that I've sort of imported. But
Mm,
honestly, the number of like D20 type games I run percentage wise is pretty low.
nice. Nice. I mean, and that makes sense. There's lots of great systems that already have
Yeah.
Cthulhu stuff in them, right?
Right.
So I have another question from Deutsch Amerikaner, and the question is, what do you think is the hardest part about writing content, and what do you think is the easiest?
Hmm. So I think that the hardest part, I think that there's two hardest parts. I think one of them is that leaving space thing that we talked about earlier. The other part, particularly if you're writing mystery type scenarios, is making
Mhm.
sure that things are reasonably accounted for. You really don't want to leave something completely interesting and fascinating open. It's better
Mhm.
to take it out entirely, which is awful. It's the killing your darlings of this kind of writing, and saying, you know what, you are a beautiful seed, and I'll put you over here and use you for something else.
Mhm.
And it's really hard to do, but it's better than leaving something too wide open. Or you can take that seed and go, okay, this is great. This is for something like the Hideous Creatures Bestiary, where we
Mhm.
wrote different sections and like, oh yeah, I can just write like a little narrative thing here or develop a clue or just literally just put it into one, you know, one clue type thing for the bestiary. Like this is what a notice clue would give you. And it gets my interesting idea out and into the world, but not
Mhm.
as a loose end. I think that's really the hard part. I think the easiest part is just sort of starting to spin and ask what could happen. Um,
Right.
it can get really, really fun when you start diving into potentials. I think sleeping on things is good. You need to read a lot. I read a lot of mysteries. I read these books, like we mentioned. They're great for scenario seed ideas. They're also great for ad libbing your game content, and they're great for if you want to write later because it's not that you're taking the specific idea. It's that you've read so much that you're like, oh, you know what? I would never have thought to do X, but let me spin this around to it. And so being willing to just take a completely new idea and run with it and see what happens and then edit yourself. And kill those darlings and pull out those seeds and plant them in the other little pots and say, okay, you guys are out, you're in. You can come up with some really interesting and weird stuff. Like I never would have thought when I did the Howling Fog thing initially, I could not figure out what the big bad was going to be. I had some ideas for the big bad, and I was like, "This isn't terribly inspiring." So I just started writing and writing out ideas, and I happened upon something which I didn't even quite realize had existed when I started. And but I was reading and I was writing out stuff, and I was like, "Oh, it's like magic in your brain." And so it may not always be the easiest, but it's fun to throw out ideas. It's also fun to have somebody to do that with if you can.
Definitely. Always collaborating is a good thing. If you can collaborate with someone you trust, that's always a
Yeah.
great thing. Um, So, one other question from Blake Ryan Batman. Have you ever written something for a horror game that's a little more lighthearted, like a Ghostbusters or Gremlins sort of style scenario?
Um, Not at this point. I think I
Mhm.
would like to. I've thought about maybe doing something like that with Fear itself, which
Mm,
could really lend itself to hijinks and lighter play. I mean, so I haven't written. I've definitely sometimes that's sort of happened to the tone of games that I've played, where it's gotten a little more hijinksy. Normally,
sure.
if I'm running somebody else's things, and it gets like a little bit fun and a little bit weird. And I think it depends a lot on the group. But in terms of writing, not yet. That is a thing that I would like to do though, because I think yeah, I can get down into the deep, like weird. Oh, like let's talk about blood druids. But it's also fun to think about stuff like, yeah, wacky hijinks, ghost adventures. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that would be a fun kind of thing to maybe put together some Halloween.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. Definitely. I love when you can do that. It can be a good break too and be great
Mhm.
fun for people.
Oh
Um
my gosh. My Yellow King game that I ran for my players was wonderful because it was fairly like was the con scenario for Gen Con this summer, and I was testing it with them, and it got fairly lighthearted, but then at the end, like it turned into sort of wacky hijinks at the end of it, which was great. Like because they're art students and it's like so much freedom, and yeah, so I think even something as weird and twisted as Yellow King can be, hijinks but with a dark undertone. Again, yeah, I have really
mhm.
gone for the more serious stuff, I guess.
Well, I think certainly seeing how many different things you've worked on, I would not be surprised if we get something like that from you soon. I also one of the things that I enjoy playing with sometimes is something that seems supernatural, and then it turns out even worse because it's something totally perpetrated by humans. Have you
Yeah.
ever played around with that either in writing or your home game?
I think that to some degree, Midnight Sub Rosa is a little bit like that, although it has a lot of
Mhm.
the house, the sort of closed house mystery or the weekend getaway kind of murder thing. I'm
Mhm.
trying to think about trying to go through a list of things that I've written. I think so normally it sometimes it's been happened it's been that the cause of the thing, yeah, a lot of the time has been a human, but there's generally always some kind of supernatural
Mhm.
element under it, mostly because if I'm writing this, it is for playing with something like Trail of Cthulhu, and I think
Yeah.
you have to think about what your player expectations are, and so it could be like it looks like a monster, it is a
Mhm.
human, but at the end of it, you kind of have to have either also there's a monster involved,
Mhm.
or um like in one scenario, the monster essentially just amplifies the human's characteristics.
Mhm.
So the
Mhm.
person is actually kind of a monster, but becomes
Right. Right.
far worse because of this influence. But it really is this person who's done this, 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 and this.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I totally love that. So, as we're wrapping up here, one of the things that I really want to ask you about is you've worked on so many amazing things. What is something that you are proudest of? And I won't hold you to it because you've worked on so many awesome things. But is there something that you're particularly like very proud of having worked on?
That is that is tricky because I think in terms of like so I would say that there's sort of three things, but there's the Cthulhu Confidential work, which I'm just really proud of that game being out in the world. I have heard great things back from people who've like, played it with their spouses or who are interested in doing that and see it as having more potential than other things. So I really love a lot of the stuff that I put into that, and sort of the variety of stories because I've written so many stories for it. For something that I
Mhm.
contributed less to, I just really love the Harlem Unbound book for ideas for going somewhere that's really rather different, for having a different tone, I think. Chris does not pull punches. He is really
Hmm.
not a punch puller when it comes to certain stuff, and I helped him audit the games for Gumshoe rules because they have both
Oh,
Gumshoe
cool.
and Call of Cthulhu rules in them. So I helped him audit those. So reading through those scenarios before they were published, like just really getting a feel for it, thinking about how I'd play them was really so that's more that something I was proud to be a part of, even though what I contributed I was really happy with. But it
Hmm.
was more the overall effect of the book when it was done. I was like, oh my gosh, this is everything that I hoped it would be,
That's
which
great.
delighted me. And then I think that the fact that I put together the little monster zine recently, not having seen myself, say, 5 years ago as a person who would have written monsters, I feel like
Right.
that's a character development arc. I've developed a points into a new skill. I've developed a new skill set. I'm trying to think about like how I would
Hmm.
express this in which game, but like yes, suddenly I got points in monster development, and having Rob Heinzu give me like his feedback on the Great Ghoul was really encouraging. And then working on the hideous creatures because he was very happy with Great Ghoul. The hideous creatures work like started getting more into thinking like bestiaries are really about stories and how could I tell a story with like the characters' powers even and how it would play out in a fight. And so I'm just really pleased with that because it's shown me that I came in with some aptitudes and I started off with certain kinds of things and I've done other things since, but even things that I don't necessarily think I can do through practice, through feedback, through encouragement. And I think giving that to
Mhm.
your peers is really important because it does help other people develop these skills. And so that I think is right now the thing that I'm most proud of is the creeping kudzu monster.
Nice. That's awesome. Um, so what are your hopes for the future of the tabletop role playing game industry, either for yourself
Ooh,
personally or for the industry as a whole?
gosh. For myself personally, I would like to come figure out a good way to make um, more generic type of mysteries more actionable. Come up with ways to make them playable in a one-to-one context. It's a
Mhm.
really tough nut to crack, actually. I have been mentally experimenting with it for a while, and I think that there are so many people, and particularly so many women, who read these books and really get engaged with them. I grew up, my mom read tons and tons of murder mystery books. And so figuring out how to do an Amelia Peabody or uh, some kind of murder she wrote kind of thing, like how that really translates to the one-to-one context, because you might think, oh, it's a natural fit. It's so hard. Like the Pelgrane model of bringing in multiple genres is really helpful and like having real monsters. And how do you do it without overly relying on police? And there's just so many thoughts that I still have to sort out. I'd love to try cracking that nut. I have lots of kudzu punk ideas for what I'd like to do in the future with that, but that's like my real challenge thing. And I think for the
Mhm.
overall community, I think as a rule, I think it's heading in a fairly good direction. I definitely would like to continue seeing more indie publishers. I'd like to see more big publishers though supporting and continuing to bring in more indie type writers. I felt very supported with Pelgrane.
Mhm.
Um, I felt generally very affirmed. I've gotten helpful feedback. I've really grown as a writer, and I think they can only do that for so many people, and there's only so many companies out there. But if more of them did more of that kind of personal development, yeah, I think it would really help the industry grow more.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I think that sounds incredible and amazing. And, because Pelgrane does that, we get to see some really cool, interesting, and unique games from them too. So
Mhm.
hopefully we continue to see more of that happen. And the final question here, before we get to where
Mhm.
people can find you and that sort of thing, is what advice would you give to someone who wants to do what you do?
Um, so my first piece of advice would definitely be to read and to read the kinds of things that you're
Mhm.
writing and to even do analyses of these. So to start asking yourself questions about what you run into, like what characteristics do these have? What components do these have? How many scenes are in your average gumshoe scenario, for example, if you want to write those? How many scenes do the average ones link to, and where do these happen at points in the thing? So really taking an analytical perspective to what you want to write will help
Mhm.
you figure out how to write for the field and the genre. That's the real challenge, I think. or that was a real challenge for me, was figuring out that kind of stuff. I think having friends and mentors who can read your work and give feedback can be very, very helpful at points in the process. But reading stuff, writing stuff, blogging, I know, people still do it. Some people still do it, but yeah, trying to get your ideas out there. The Eldritch Icon stuff really, really helped me work through those problems while I was understanding more again about the ideas of monsters and such,
Mm-hmm.
and turned me into somebody that I didn't necessarily think I would be. And then definitely try to write for the stuff that you love, for your community, and don't try to bend yourself out of shape writing for a different kind of game, at least at first. It's a good
Nice.
flex, but if you're starting off and you play so much D&D, then really write D20 kind of material. Maybe stretch yourself by writing for 13th Age or for Pathfinder, but don't, like, it's okay to be good at your thing and then
Mhm.
flex yourself beyond that.
Nice. That's excellent. Well, I think that's great advice. Ruth, where can people find you on the internet?
I think the best place to find my work right now is actually just the Arkham Archivist website. So it's arkhamarchivist.com. Got my portfolio on the front page. I've got a blog on there that I occasionally update, and I'm still kind of kicking around a couple of ideas for there, but it's got some of my older content and links to some of the other stuff I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't say that I have too much of a specific gaming web presence right now, because I've been really focused this fall and coming into the next year on a large project that I'm doing in the library. Um,
Mhm.
so I think that's probably the best place to find me, and then I'll put up links to places like this podcast, other places I've done panels and interviews, and you can generally find me at Gen Con, running games and that kind of thing.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Ruth, thank you so, so much for talking with me today. And thank you for all of the amazing work that you've put forth and all of the awesome stuff that you do for this community. I really appreciate it. And if people want to follow this show, you can click the follow button up there. And you could also watch us on YouTube on the Encounter Roleplay YouTube channel, or go to don'tsplittthepodcastnetwork.com, and you can find out about subscribing to this as a podcast and hearing all of our awesome, amazing guests who have been on the show and who will be on the show. Next week, I've got Eugenio Vargas, who is an amazing streamer. So get ready to hear from him. And in the meantime, everybody have a good holiday. Be very, very kind to each other.
Thanks so much,
See ya.
James. Talk to you
Of
later.
course.